All right, so are you ready for this? You wanted to get a clearer picture of the Palestinian situation. And it's complicated, right? We've got all your notes and articles here, even some interesting audio in Spanish. Let's try to untangle it together.
Yeah, and to start untangling this, I think it's good to recognize that Palestine isn't one simple, single entity. It's deeply divided. You have the two main territories, Gaza and the West Bank, each with its own governing authority. Plus, millions of Palestinians living outside in surrounding countries, mainly in refugee camps. It's like a puzzle with pieces scattered across the Middle East.
Right, so multiple groups, all vying for control, different levels of autonomy, and a history that's, well, let's just say it's seen its share of turmoil. But is a unified Palestinian Authority even possible in this fractured landscape?
I think that's the core question, isn't it? And to even begin to answer it, we have to understand how we got here. So let's rewind back before the establishment of Israel in 1948, back to when Palestine was under British control. Even then, you had both Jewish and Palestinian settlements present, which kind of set the stage for the conflict.
And then the 1948 war explodes, reshaping everything. Israel's victory leads to the division of land, and the Palestinians lose authority in their own territory. Gaza ends up under Egyptian control, the West Bank under Jordanian control. What a seismic shift.
Yeah, imagine the impact, right? Displacement from your own land, loss of self-governance, and this is really the backdrop against which the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, emerges in 1964.
The PLO, led by Yasser Arafat and his Fatah party, they initially focused on armed liberation, right? A secular nationalist group.
Yes, and that's an important distinction to keep in mind, because they faced another major upheaval a few years later, the Six-Day War in 1967, where Israel gained control of both Gaza and the West Bank, which forced the PLO into exile in Lebanon.
But even in exile, they didn't fade away. By the 70s and 80s, the PLO gained international recognition as the representative of the Palestinian people. But the tensions with Israel obviously simmered.
Yeah, and this is where it gets interesting. While the PLO launched attacks against Israel, they also started undergoing a strategic shift. The First Intifada in 1987, a Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation, really marked a turning point toward diplomacy for the PLO.
Ah, so the seeds of negotiation, right, being sown even amid conflict. Which leads us to the Oslo Accords in the 90s. Such a landmark moment. You have the mutual recognition between the PLO and Israel, and then the creation of the Palestinian National Authority, or PNA, meant to govern both Gaza and the West Bank. It seemed like a real breakthrough.
It did, but the situation on the ground was complex. And a new player had kind of entered the scene during that first Intifada, Hamas, a more radical Islamist group who gained popularity.
And this is what's so fascinating. They weren't just about armed resistance. They actually developed these very effective social programs, which filled a void left by the PNA. It challenges that simplistic terrorist label that's so often thrown at them.
Right. Their dual focus on militancy and social welfare made them this complex entity, and their popularity really grew. So now you have this stark contrast. Fatah, part of the PLO, pursuing negotiation and diplomacy, and Hamas advocating armed resistance. This division comes to a head in 2005 when Israel withdraws from Gaza,
leaving the PNA under Fatah's control to govern. But then the plot twist. Hamas wins the 2006 Palestinian election.
A major upset. And, the international community, wary of Hamas's stance towards Israel, largely boycotted the new government. Tensions with Fatah escalated, and in 2007, Hamas forcibly ousted Fatah from Gaza.
A divided rule emerges. Hamas in control of Gaza, Fatah PLO controlling parts of the West Bank. And then enter the blockade.
Right. Following the Hamas takeover, Israel, citing security concerns, imposes a blockade on Gaza. And Egypt partially joins in. The West Bank itself is fragmented, which further complicates the idea of a unified Palestinian Authority.
Wait, hold on. Let's break that down a bit. You've got these areas, A, B, and C, each with different levels of Palestinian and Israeli control. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, good point. It is important to understand those distinctions. Area A is under full Palestinian civil and security control. So that's where you see more Palestinian institutions and, relatively speaking, a greater sense of autonomy.
So life there's a bit closer to normal.
Yeah.
Compared to Gaza, which is essentially sealed off.
Yes. But even in Area A, there are still Israeli checkpoints and restrictions. Then you have Area B, where the Palestinian Authority has civil control, but security is controlled by Israel. Imagine living with this constant presence of Israeli forces, knowing they can enter your community at any time.
Okay, so even areas designated as under Palestinian control still have these layers of complexity.
Yeah.
And then there's Area C,
Yeah, the largest part of the West Bank.
Yeah.
And it's under full Israeli control. And yes, that's where most of the Israeli settlements are located, which, complicates matters further.
It's like this constant pressure, shrinking the space for Palestinian life and autonomy.
Yeah.
And woven through all of this, you have this separation barrier.
Right. Often referred to as the wall by Palestinians. It cuts through the West Bank, separating communities, disrupting livelihoods, and further limiting Palestinian movement. Imagine having to go through checkpoints just to visit family in a neighboring village.
So instead of a unified Palestinian Authority, you have this fragmented reality, a patchwork of areas with different rules, different levels of control, a constant sense of uncertainty. And it's not just geographic, right? This uncertainty seeps into the political realm as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we talked about the split between Hamas and Fatah. But even within the West Bank, you have divisions within Fatah itself and a growing sense of disillusionment with the Palestinian Authority.
Okay, so even in areas with some degree of self-governance, there's friction, a lack of unity. It seems like achieving a unified Palestinian Authority faces an uphill battle, both internally and externally. But there's another piece of this puzzle we can't forget, the Palestinian diaspora.
Right. The millions of Palestinians living in those refugee camps in neighboring countries, mainly in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. These camps aren't just temporary settlements. They've become like cities with their own power struggles and allegiances, adding another layer to this whole intricate situation. And these camps, they aren't isolated, They can be influenced by groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or those pro-Iranian militias in Syria we mentioned. Those militias have their own agendas in the region, and while their sway within the camps could potentially draw the Palestinian diaspora into future conflicts.
Right, so it's not just about land and borders, but this intricate web of alliances, ideologies, and power dynamics, extending beyond Palestine itself. Makes you realize how interconnected everything is.
Yeah, exactly. And all of this, it feeds back into that question of a unified Palestinian Authority. If the diaspora were to play a more active role, would it help to bridge those internal divisions, or would it further complicate an already tangled situation?
It's a question without easy answers, for sure. But before we get too lost in the geopolitical weeds, I think it's important to zoom in and ask, what is life actually like for Palestinians living under these conditions?
Well, let's start with Gaza, which has been under an Israeli blockade for over 17 years now. This means strict control on the movement of people and goods, impacting everything from basic supplies to economic opportunities.
I've read about the blockade, but it's hard to truly grasp what that means for daily life. You're essentially trapped, right?
Essentially, yeah. And the consequences are dire. I mean, unemployment is sky high, poverty is widespread. Access to essential services like healthcare and education is severely limited. Imagine living with constant power outages, a shortage of clean water, and this constant fear of renewed conflict.
Wow, so daily life, it just becomes this struggle for survival.
Yeah.
You're telling me they even lack some basic things that that we take for granted. And we can't forget that Hamas, the governing authority in Gaza, has a very different approach than Fatah in the West Bank. How does that impact things?
Well, their governance is heavily influenced by their interpretation of Islamic law,
Right.
which affects social norms, the legal system, even cultural expression. There's a level of control there, even as they try to provide social services. It creates a very unique set of circumstances for people living in Gaza.
Okay, so life in Gaza is shaped by both the external pressures of the blockade and the internal realities of Hamas rule. What about the West Bank? Is it any different?
In some ways, yes, it's not under full blockade, so there is more economic activity and movement of people. But it's still divided into those areas A, B, and C we talked about, with varying levels of Palestinian and Israeli control.
Right, that's what I wanted to circle back to.
Yep.
You mentioned Area A has a greater sense of autonomy, but it's not complete freedom, is it?
No, not at all. While there is more Palestinian governance, even in Area A, there are still Israeli checkpoints and restrictions that can disrupt daily life. And then it gets even more complicated in Area B, where the Palestinian Authority has civil control, but security is actually controlled by Israel.
So you could be going about your day, and suddenly there's this Israeli military presence.
Exactly. Imagine that tension, right? Knowing that your movements are being monitored, that your community can be entered at any time, makes life very unpredictable and fuels resentment.
And then there's Area C, the largest chunk of the West Bank, and the one that's under full Israeli control. That's also where most of the settlements are, right?
Yes, and the continued expansion of those settlements, that's a major, major source of tension. It makes it increasingly difficult for Palestinians to access land, resources, even basic services.
It's like their land is constantly shrinking, their options narrowing. And then you add in the separation barrier, cutting through the West Bank, dividing families and communities, creating this fragmented reality that's hard to even grasp.
And within that fragmented reality, there's also a deep sense of disillusionment. Many Palestinians, they feel abandoned by the Palestinian Authority, frustrated by its inability to really provide basic services or security.
So even in areas where Palestinians have some degree of self-governance, there's this feeling that the system isn't working for them. It's like a pressure cooker with all these internal and external forces pushing down.
And this is where the stories, the human experiences become so important. We can talk about political structures and historical events, but it's the individual lives that truly illustrate the impact of this conflict.
Yeah, we can't lose sight of the human cost.
Yeah.
Right. Beyond the headlines and the political maneuvering, there are real people just trying to live, to raise families,
Yeah.
to find some semblance of normalcy in all of this chaos.
Exactly. Think about the children growing up in Gaza, having experienced multiple wars, living with that constant fear of bombardment, their education disrupted, their healthcare limited, their future uncertain.
It's hard to imagine the psychological toll that must take. What about the families separated by the separation barrier? Or the farmers who can no longer access their land because of settlements or security zones?
These are the stories that often get lost, in the broader political discourse. These are the human faces of this conflict, the people whose lives are directly impacted by decisions made far beyond their control.
So we have this complex interplay of political realities, historical baggage, and the daily struggle for survival. It paints a picture of people caught in the middle, trying to find their way in a system that feels rigged against them. It feels like we've been going deeper and deeper into this, and with every layer we peel back, it just gets more complex. So where do we go from here? What are the potential paths forward? What does the future hold for this idea of a unified Palestinian Authority?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, the
Yeah.
two-state solution. With an independent Palestine alongside Israel, it's been the dominant framework for decades. But it seems increasingly distant.
With the ongoing expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, the deep divisions between Hamas and Fatah, and the lack of meaningful progress in negotiations. It's hard to imagine that two-state solution actually happening.
Yeah, and yet the status quo is unsustainable, right? I mean, the current situation, it just breeds resentment, it fuels extremism, it leaves millions of Palestinians without basic rights or a clear future. Something has to change.
Okay, so if the two-state solution is fading, what other options are on the table? A single binational state, where Israelis and Palestinians have equal rights? Or is there some other arrangement we haven't even considered?
Well, this is where I think the role of the Palestinian diaspora becomes really intriguing. They represent a significant portion of the Palestinian population, and their perspectives and their experiences, they're often overlooked in these discussions.
Yeah, right. We haven't talked much about what they want. Could they be a catalyst for change? Could they act as a bridge between, the fractured realities within Palestine and the broader international community?
I think they certainly have the potential. They have a voice. They have resources. And they have a vested interest in the future of Palestine. How they choose to engage and how that engagement is received by others could have a huge impact on the trajectory of this whole conflict.
It's like we've been so focused on the internal dynamics within Palestine that we've overlooked this this massive external force. That could play a really pivotal role. It makes you realize how much we still don't know.
Exactly. I think that's the beauty of these deep dives, right? It's not about providing all the answers. It's about raising the right questions.
Well, I think you've definitely achieved that. We started by asking if a unified Palestinian Authority was even possible in this
Right. Yeah.
fractured landscape. And now, after exploring all these layers of history, politics, and lived experiences, it feels like that question has become even more complex.
But also more crucial. Because understanding these complexities, grappling with the nuances, that's really the first step towards finding solutions.
So we've reached the end of our deep dive. But in a way, it feels like we're just getting started. We've unpacked these historical layers, the political complexities, and the human stories that make this situation so challenging. But I think we've also opened up new avenues for exploration, new questions to ponder.
Yeah, like, what role might the diaspora play in shaping the future of Palestine? What are the alternative solutions beyond the two-state model? And most importantly, how can we move beyond the political rhetoric and truly understand the lived experiences of those most impacted by this conflict? I think those are questions worth wrestling with.
Absolutely. Because ultimately, finding a just and lasting resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it isn't just a political goal. It's a moral imperative.
Yeah.
And the more we understand these complexities, the better equipped we'll be to actually contribute to that solution. So keep digging, keep questioning, and keep seeking out those diverse perspectives. It's a tangled web, for sure. But untangling it starts with each of us